Hi, this is Blogging Heads, and I guess we're supposed to introduce ourselves. I'm Ta-Nehisi Coates, contributing editor for The Atlantic and blogger at theatlantic.com, and I am here with...
Brian Beutler, esteemed editor-in-chief of brianbeutler.com.
That sounds so much better.
The high-powered brianbeutler.com.
Yeah, I like it when it's your own thing. It just, it gives you a sort of importance. My dad was an entrepreneur, so I always have respect for people who have their own names in the title of what they do.
Yeah, I mean, it feels nice, although all that is tempered by the degree of obscurity that I face. So I can feel really good about not having to answer to anybody or put up X number of posts per day to make my bosses happy, but then again, I'm not blogging for the Atlantic Monthly, so so there's give and take.
But you have friends in high places because this incident that we're here to talk about today, I actually saw it on Megan's blog first.
Right.
And so why don't we go into that? I guess after that I can go into my response, and we can let the conversation branch out from there.
Sure. Okay, most of what fame I do have comes from an incident that happened, I guess a little over 4 months ago now. I'm kind of right 5 months ago.
Yeah, this summer.
July 2nd, at about 2 in the morning. I was with a friend that evening, and we had gone to a bar, and we were on our way home from that bar, and decided to, at the last minute, make a cut down a street, Euclid Street in Northwest D.C.
Euclid and what, by the way?
Euclid between 16th and 17th.
Jesus, this is getting creepy now. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's sort of creepy for me because I used to live on 16th and Crescent, which is like a block south. Normally if we were going to go up to Adams Morgan, we would have taken U Street, for those who are familiar with D.C., up to 18th and walked where it's well lit, well peopled and everything. But that was my neighborhood for a year, and I'm still around there a lot. I'd been up and down that street at later hours alone, and there's lore about that street corner, 17th and Euclid, and I'm aware of it. But I'm also sort of practical about things like this. I know that most people who walk down Euclid Street at any time of day don't get mugged and shot.
Right.
But turns out that's what happened to me. I mean, I guess I didn't get mugged because I didn't lose anything. But we were approached by two what appeared to be teenage black kids. We were both trying to get in touch with some other friends to have them come join us. So we both had our phones out. They were visible, and that's what these two kids approached us to ask for. And it was probably an 8 to 10 second interaction in total. Sort of. We were a little bit incredulous, there wasn't, they didn't, there were two of them, there were two of us, there was no visible gun right away, and it was sort of like, are we going to end up in a fist fight? This is, bummer, and there was some adrenaline, but it was mainly just, you don't really want to do this, do you? And they were pretty serious, and at that point, one of the kids passed a gun, which I believe turned out to be a 25 caliber handgun to his friend, and then started darting off. He freaked or something. So his buddy just followed him, and almost as a passing, thought, maybe angry that we hadn't been more, welcoming or something, fired off 3 shots, all of which hit me, 1 in the shoulder, 2, if viewers can see, right in on the left side of my chest, and then they left. I didn't know what had happened. I knew I'd been knocked down. I can describe pretty vividly what it feels like to be shot at close range by a gun of that size, but it feels like getting knocked down. In short. And I got right back up, and I felt like I had the wind knocked out of me, and my shoulder kind of hurt. But mainly I was just freaked out. I'd heard a loud noise, and after having seen a gun, and then the kids ran off, and didn't really know what happened. So my friend and I, we moved down the street. We started.
So you started walking after you got shot?
Yeah, running even. And at that point, about 2 or 3 seconds after we started moving, I touched my shoulder and I felt that it was wet. And I thought, damn it. So I took my shirt off, and there was blood. And so at that point, I said, hey Matt, you got to call an ambulance.
Right.
And we kept moving, and the people on the other end, 911, they were like, stop moving, we got to find you guys. And Matt was like, but we're trying to get away from these guys who just shot my friend. So we rounded the corner and decided it would be a good place to stop, but also that was the point at which I started realizing that other things were wrong, and that I was feeling really weak, and that my abdomen really hurt and was swelling, and I just couldn't move anymore. And fortunately, the ambulance response was phenomenal. I know DC has had a lot of problems with that. There was actually a journalist, either for the Washington Post or the New York Times, I can't remember, a couple years ago, who got whacked in the head by an assailant, and the ambulance company, I think they took a long time to get there, and they just propped him up in the emergency room and didn't really attend to him as they should have, and he died as a result. So I mean, there's sort of famous problems with DC's emergency response, but in my case it was phenomenal. They got there, they worked extremely fast, and I was conscious the whole time, and that may be due to the way they handled themselves. They were asking me, for my social security number, for my father's cell phone number, for just information, and I think they needed the information, but they could have got it later, and probably they were doing it to make sure that my brain was still working, that I hadn't lost so much blood, that I was in more serious danger. And it was reassuring to me to know that, okay, I've been shot. This is a bad situation, but at least I'm with it enough that I can remember this, information. And they got me to the hospital real quick. Within half an hour, I was in surgery. I only lost consciousness when they gave me the anesthetic. And in surgery, they performed what is called experimental laparotomy. They basically cut open my chest and looked inside to see where the damage was, and they found that I had puncture wounds in my lung and my diaphragm, and my spleen and my stomach, and I had an exit wound in my back, out my back, that's about a centimeter or so from my spine. Everything, they stapled up the stomach. They had to take the spleen out. The collapsed lung healed over the course of about it healed over the course of about a week, but my lung capacity returned to normal within about a month and a half or 2. And I got out of the hospital 8 days later, I think, feeling very weak, but no appetite. I felt like abdominal pain, but sort of like I had done 1,000 sit-ups the night. And I felt like that for a couple weeks, and then that kind of went away. And you're looking at me now in the first or second week at which I really feel 100%, where I'm exercising again, and none the worse for wear, except for the small risks posed by not having a spleen, and also a few unsightly scars on my chest and shoulder. And back, but here I am. I'm happy to be alive, and it got me onto Blogging Heads TV. So
how about that?
I have that to be thankful for.
Yeah, he made you famous.
There's a silver lining around every dark cloud. When I woke up in the hospital, there was an awesome outpouring. I was really touched. Yeah. But one of the first people I saw, to my surprise, was Spencer Ackerman, who I think we both know. At least I know him very well, and he told me that news of what had happened had made the rounds in the blog sphere, and that I should be prepared for it. And only later did I go back and look at what people had written, and also the comment sections of those blogs, which were fascinating. And I came across your post, and that was actually the first time I'd heard of you. I think. I mean, I think you had just come aboard at the Atlantic, and
no, I hadn't actually. I had.
You weren't there yet.
No, it was still just I was Ta-Nehisi of Ta-NehisiCoats.com.
Okay.
Or Ta-Nehisi.com.
Well, a month later or whatever, when I did Google around or whatever, and I found it, the link took me to the Atlantic site. Gotcha. So all your stuff had been input. Anyway, and I read that post, and I thought it was fascinating. And so I thought, I mean, I don't know if you have more to say than what you wrote in it, and I guess it'll be linked to all the viewers. But you wrote basically about realizing or coming to understand for the first time how it is scared white people who behave like scared white people, why they do that. And speaking as somebody who never really did that, but who witnessed it his whole life because I grew up among white people mainly, it was interesting to me at least to realize that this was sort of a mystery to some people. So I want you to talk about, I mean, how this all hit you and where you came up with that post, which was provocative.
Right. There's this sort of thing, at least for me, with blogging, where there's a natural inclination. I don't know if you do this, but you go through whatever's on the web and you point out what you're pissed off about and who's wrong and who's right, and that's sort of like a baseline, for a lot of blogging.
Yeah, have you seen the cartoon where there's a stick figure at a computer and he said, "I'll be there in a second, honey. Somebody's wrong on the internet."
No, I haven't, but that's about it.
I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you. Yeah.
I'd love to see that. But the much more, I think, interesting from a narrative perspective, and the much more, I just feel like, challenging thing is to deal with what you actually learned. So where were you short on certain things? Where was there? Yeah, I was reading this profile of Naomi Klein in the New Yorker this week, and they quote her mother, and her mother talks about how ideologically strident she had been at one point. And she says, an enemy is someone whose stories you haven't heard. And she's quoting somebody else, and that just stopped me, because that's sort of one of these things, like, for me, the transformational moments are learning, are seeing things in a different way. And I'm rambling here, as I tend to do. So forgive me for that.
But that's what makes, actually, as just a side note, that's what I think makes your blog fascinating. That
I ramble so much.
Well, you call it rambling, but the grappling with thoughts you didn't know you had, or the ideas that you didn't know you were you possessed because you hadn't really addressed them, and you're just coming to them for the first time. Anyway, that's just me kissing your ass. But anyway, go on. And remind me to get back to that Naomi Klein quote, because that actually has like some bearing, it turns out, on the reaction people had to me getting shot and the sort of things that they said to me. But anyway, go ahead.
So the thing was that on the one hand, it's I've been writing about race for most of my professional career. From a particular perspective, it is very easy to sort of sneer at white folks who, for lack of a better way of saying this, roll up their windows in bad black neighborhoods, right, or in any black neighborhood.
Right.
It is also easy to write a sneering polemic for why they should do that. Do you know what I mean? Like, to say, to sort of defend that without actually grappling with it, to defend it with some sort of animosity towards black people. One thing that I had to think about, and it wasn't even so much, because I didn't, I hadn't read anything, obviously, that you had written about it, because you were in surgery. I had read, Megan and I think Ezra and maybe Matt, a couple other people. I think Matt was the first one that said something that he didn't say it was you. He didn't want to say who it was. But what caught me was two things. First, the idea that you guys, and I say you guys as a blogging community living in D.C., I think there are quite a few political bloggers in D.C., perceive D.C. as particularly violent. And it wasn't that statistically that was not true, but that, I guess I should say, and this is why I was saying it was creepy. I went to Howard University. I lived in D.C. for about 8 years. Actually, my apartment was on 15th and Euclid. I lived at the corner of 15th and Euclid, across from the Meridian Dorm and Malcolm X Park and all of that. Worked at Washington City Paper, which is at, just off of Champlain and Euclid. So I've walked that street many, many times. And it was, but I was there at a point where D.C. had not been, as gentrified as it has now. But that was always a shady area. It was always a shady little, a group of people around there. One of the things that happens, though, before I lived in D.C., I come from West Baltimore, grew up there. I live in Harlem now. I've always lived in neighborhoods where, I guess, for whatever reason, things were, more violent than was the norm in this country. I don't say that as any sort of braggadocio or anything like that. I don't. And that was one of the things, I wanted to get across. I mean, it's not about a sort of, you don't know the rules or whatever. Having said that, there are ways that I think you almost acquaint yourself to that sort of violence. And once you're acquainted to it, and I don't know if this is good or bad, it almost goes out of your mind. It becomes this is the way it is. There's a busted street light here, I'm not walking there. If I see those 3 dudes on the corner there, I'm across the street. A whole litany of rules. And when I came to Howard, one of the things that would happen is the local element, the local criminal element of D.C., because we think of this as a white-black thing, they would look out for Howard students, because Howard students were seen as particularly easy prey. The belief was that these were people who had not necessarily, a portion of us had grown up in cities, but the belief was that a lot of these people were not familiar with city neighborhoods, were not familiar with how you walk down the street to look like, you're aware. And so those are the people who they target. And when, I'm going to be honest with you, when I was at Howard, we would laugh at people like that. I mean, I was young, somewhat immature, and, we would make fun of people like that. It occurred to me, though, that what if you were someone, and I don't even know that you felt that way. As you said, you probably didn't feel this way, but what if you were someone who, just as sure as someone will target you as an outsider, as someone who is easy prey because of, where you look like you come from, it's easy to then make the leap and see how they would use race as a similar proxy.
Right.
So the idea being that, just as sure as, you look like you're a Howard student, so you're not from around here, you don't know the neighborhood. You're white, you're probably not from around here, you probably don't know the neighborhood. Thus giving them, in their mind, what appears to them to be more of a soft target. Now, right. It's very easy for me to say that. I'm 6'4". I don't know, what your proportions are, but I sense that, in addition to that, maybe the reasons why I, never had a situation like that in D.C. is because people also, and I think Megan talked about this. She got into the comments section and talked about, because she had some incidents herself, that people, look for easier fights or whatever. What I'm trying to get to is, it was the first moment where I thought about it, and I said, well, let's take this from the other side. Mm-hmm. If someone, I have my own uneasiness. There are certain areas of Mississippi that are not black that I don't want to drive through. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons why this Barack Obama thing has been so transformational for me is, literally, I think in the minds of a lot of black people, not only did we think Barack Obama couldn't win in Iowa, what sort of black person would live in Iowa? Because the history and the legacy of racial violence, rightly or wrongly, is prominent in our minds. It's right. Prominent. The era of lynching, it lives there. It just stays there. Emmett Till is there. No matter that it happened in Mississippi, it's there in your mind. And, you draw certain conclusions from that. I understand that that's not the same as, a fear of crime. I'm not saying it's necessarily the same. But it's the same in terms of fear. It's the same in terms of how human beings, I think, react in order to protect themselves. Right.
That's exactly what I thought when I read your post. That maybe it's exaggerated because a lot of the bloggers in D.C. grew up in a sort of cocoon where they were pretty safe from stuff like this. They have an inordinate fear of being victimized, and maybe people who have been cocooned in general, because they're afraid of being victimized, and maybe because they have racial animosities too, or whatever, they identify things rightly or wrongly that they see mm-hmm. as being a high risk for victimization, right? Right. They roll up their windows not necessarily because they're racist, but because they're terrified of what they perceive to be a threat of crime.
Right.
And
right.
you could, that goes too far, obviously, right? I mean, I think you can sort of you can judge based on the behavior whether it's sort of a different category when you avoid a certain street and walk down a different one than it is to lock your doors when you're at an intersection in the middle of the day, right? That at some point people aren't really that like the threat any rational person would see isn't so high that that's necessary, and what that at some level there is like a racial element working there. But that's not how I think the fact that I was there in the first place is sort of just goes to show that that's not that you're right, that people just become accustomed to their environment, whether they're black or white, whether they're high risk for being victimized or low risk. Is that when I moved to DC, people warned me, don't go below 14th Street, because that's what they had been told when they came to visit by other scared white people or tourists or whatever. And I got there and I found 14th Street to be fantastic, and that you go even further east, there's even more interesting stuff, and yes, it does get more dangerous, but it's also good. There's also plenty of good stuff to do. But Euclid Street has gang activity. On that corner of 17th and Euclid, it's just kind of a hub.
Right. And
I knew that before this happened.
Right.
I knew that a lot of my friends had been mugged in the course, and I at some level expected at some day to be mugged, and I didn't fear it, and I just got on with, you got to get on with, if you want to live in the nation's capital, you've got to accept that, and maybe it's a testament to everybody who chooses to live here that they do, but the real truth is that most people don't get shot. Most people, if they're victimized, they're not terribly victimized. They're their lives aren't almost taken from them.
You know what? Not to cut you off, I want to go back to something. I just, before we get too deep in this, I really want to go back to something that you said earlier in this story that you told, and this just rang incredibly true to me. That there's a way, having not talked to you, and in all honesty, this is the way I actually thought it went down. Of you think of mugging, guy pulls out gun, give me your wallet. You either give it or you don't, and then the guy shoots you, and and runs off. What actually happened was, and again, correct me if I'm wrong here. One guy pulls out the gun, gets scared because I guess he doesn't expect you guys to put up any sort of resistance. Hands it over to his friend, who kind of runs and shoots you in a panic. Do I have that right?
Well, no. I mean, the guy who shot me wasn't all that panicked. I mean,
okay, he was cool.
He was a little bit cooler, and his aim was not so bad, right?
But what was his goal? I mean, if you think about it, it's almost like, it strikes me like what's his goal? So he didn't shoot you and then say, okay, now I'm gonna rummage through his stuff and take his money, right?
Oh, right. No, I mean that's the thing is that the stuff he was after, he left it with me. I didn't lose a cent or a piece of equipment. Just a single organ. I was told later by the lead detective, who totally dropped the ball on the case and hasn't contacted me. But he talked to my father and said that he said that if these kids weren't already in a gang, then this was their way in. This was what they were doing to get initiated. And that's sort of what I thought when I woke up. And a friend of mine who I trust says that the passing of the gun is sort of indicative of perhaps the older, already initiated, handing it over to the younger kid to pull off. So I don't know if the first guy ran off because he was scared or because it was just part of the game plan. That I don't know if it was two kids who were trying to get some phones and then kind of freaked out when it didn't go down as quickly as they wanted it to, or if it was two kids who were out to shoot an innocent person because that's what they were told to do. But either way, it was peculiar, and I mean, just on a personal note, I think I have there's a small benefit to me for having not been through something like a more traditional mugging. I mean, I obviously would have rather not gotten shot, but given that I didn't, I never had this moment where there was a guy holding a gun in my face for a long time, and I was scared for my life and panicking and begging not to be shot. It was just really like I got shot before I knew I was in danger of being shot.
Right.
And so I don't suffer nightmares. I don't suffer too much in the way of post-traumatic stress.
So I have to ask you a question.
Sure.
And you can, again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you are now a liberal who's been mugged by reality.
Yes.
Have your politics altered any?
No. But I recommend, and we're going to have a whole bunch of links up, I'm sure. I recommend that everybody really ought to read through those comments because this happened right in the wake of the Supreme Court decision on the D.C. gun ban,
yes,
and everyone was talking about about that. Like the incident sort of became a football in that argument. And the Washington Post contacted me and asked me if I wanted to write a story about having been thrust into that position of being a football and whether it was weird. And I sort of didn't find it weird at all. I found it very natural. That I grew up in a smallish city in Southern California, and absolutely, if somebody got shot in Redlands, California, on the streets there would be city council meetings, and there would be loud, angry debates about what to do about guns, and it's just totally natural that when something like this happens in a community, whether it's an online community or a real one, that people understand that there are political realities that underlie those incidents, and they argue about them. I didn't think it was weird, and as a result, I didn't get to write the Washington Post piece. But people came to me and asked me, if you were liberal before, are you liberal now? Did this? I was asked by a lot of people, some people who I'm sort of surprised I was asked by, whether this had unearthed any racist thoughts or latent racism in me that. I don't want to say too much. I don't want to paint myself as a bad guy. Certainly, like, going through something like this triggers angry thoughts, and I definitely had several angry thoughts about the kids who did it and the whatever gang they run in, and and I even harbored a revenge fantasy or two, but. But people would ask me like what I would do if I could get the kid alone, like the Wire style, where he's handcuffed in a interrogation room.
Right.
And that's why I wanted to go back to that Naomi Klein quote.
Yes.
Because and I'm not sure I'd ever get an answer out of somebody who's that deep into that kind of lifestyle. But I'd want to know what the hell he thought he was doing and why. How did he get there? I mean, I'm sure that the comment section of this Blogging Heads is going to call me. Somebody's going to call me an idiot for saying that. That liberals will like give their enemies the rope that they use to hang them or whatever. And that I should be furious and that I should carry a gun with me and that that I should have had a gun with me at that moment, and that we should have had some sort of Dirty Harry style shoot off or something like that. But I mean, as far as changing any of my underlying beliefs about the world or the way race relations work in this world or the way the criminal justice system works, no, I mean I haven't fundamentally changed at all.
You know what else? You know what else too? And I'm sure someone will make that comment. That rebuttal. I've always thought greatly misrepresents the point of quote unquote hearing someone else's stories. You don't hear other people's stories for their benefit. You do it for your own. Mm-hmm. You do it because you want to know. You do it because you believe in a sort of long-term safety. In other words, you do it there's your self-interest in that. You know, it's not a favor. You know, it's this whole sort of thing. And I guess some people fall into this category of, you know, this idea of, oh, it's just, you know, sort of white liberal condescension, you know, not being straight up, the guy's a thug, da-da-da-da-da, whatever. But you don't do that as any favor to the dude that mugged you. That really isn't the point. You know, you do it, you know, hope that, you know, should you have kids one day, maybe they don't, you know, they'll be able to walk down that street. You know, that, you know, that street isn't safe for your kids until it's safe for, you know, the kids that live there. That really, to me, is the point of trying to understand that. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I could hear that, you know, coming, but frankly, I would have been shocked if your politics had changed. I mean, I know there's this, you know, tradition of, you know, people, that sort of thing happening, but I tend to think that people, you know, probably harbored those, you know, sort of inclinations anyway. Yeah. And that just, you know, gives them license to then say that. It is. You know,
I'm sure I was more short-tempered with people, and I'm sure, you know, I know for a fact I haven't been back. I've been on Euclid Street since then, and at night, but not at 2 a.m. and not when there was nobody around. I mean, there are small changes in behavior that I've made that I don't think I'll even keep forever. But you know, what I thought would be useful for me was not to hole up and become a political reactionary, but to figure out a way, and I'm working on this slowly, to figure out a way to you know, to get set up to talk to, you know, young high school, junior high school aged kids who go to school in this neighborhood, you know, who have friends who do stuff like shoot kids in the street, and you know, give them the victim side of the story, but not from an angry victim, you know, like you do bad things perspective, but from a, you know, there's like a human consequence to this, and the people that you're shooting, they're not evil people, and they're not, you know, and you know, maybe you know that, and maybe that's just part of the point of why kids in gangs shoot innocent people, but just sort of like put a human face. It's just, you know, that's the knowledge I can give back, right? Right. And that's the flip side to wanting to know why it is that this sort of thing happens in the first place. You know, so you know, you can only learn so much from watching The Wire. You know,
So I wanted to, there was something that we touched on earlier that I wanted to also get in here. I know we didn't talk about this beforehand, but I wonder to what extent, and not even necessarily particularly in your, we both live in two communities that are undergoing some degree of gentrification. I'm here in Harlem where things are just changing, and you're down in D.C. I don't know that you know, necessarily played in as a force with your specific incident, but I wonder to what extent, because, again, the feeling I got was that it was quite common among folks in the blogging community down there to know people or to have themselves experience some sort of violent crime at, you know, the hands of, let's be frank, you know, young black kids, young black boys, that's and men, that's who's going to be there. To what extent do you detect the hand of any sort of resentment at gentrification playing into that, or is that just too big? I mean, are people just, you know, moving on an individual level? Am I, you know, going too ideological there?
I don't know, man. There's very little I could divine from my experience. You know, there was not a racial word uttered. There was, you know, in that exchange, like they didn't say anything to me other than that they wanted my stuff and that they weren't real pleased that I wasn't giving it to them. But you know, the most I could say is that the gentrification itself puts white people in that position, like where if there wasn't a community where white kids like to hang out in Adams Morgan, there wouldn't be white kids walking down some of the darker streets you have to take to get there, right? But I haven't looked at. I don't know statistically, and I don't know psychologically how big of an impact it's had, on the minds of young black kids who are at risk for joining gangs or whatever. Whether that's the sort of pressure that maybe maybe makes it more likely that they'll join in the first place. That wouldn't surprise me.
Right.
But I would imagine that if there's a connection, it's sort of it's a little bit more distant than just kids who are up in arms because their aunts or their grandparents or their parents lost their homes or their neighborhoods.
Right, and not to so much imply that sort of one-to-one direct correlation, but more like people are already angry, and they take their anger out on folks who are around. So they find causes and they find outlets. Mm-hmm. So you're in a neighborhood. I have a couple white friends who live up here in Harlem, and the stories. And it could New York is a different animal, and that's the other thing I find. Everywhere is a little different, but the stories they've told me are deeply horrifying. I do have to say that, to the extent that, again, it is giving you some sort of vantage point of, if only a brief window into the world of how it must be to be white, because as they describe a couple of incidents they've had in Harlem, I can't imagine it. I'm like, really? That happened? You know what I mean? It's like sort of like when black people say, well, this is what happened when somebody say, nah, you didn't see, you saw it wrong. That couldn't have happened.
Right.
They're my friends. So I say, well, yeah, that obviously happened, but nevertheless, the sense of disbelief is there. What I'm trying to get to is not so much that people necessarily, even legitimately, feel that gentrification sent me into a gang or gentrification had my mother evicted, as much as I wonder if the gentrifiers become targets for a race that's already there.
I think, in as much as if you spend a lot of time in a neighborhood, if you grow up in a neighborhood, you learn, no matter who you are, what the neighborhood, you learn the faces and the mannerisms and the so forth of the people who know they belong there.
Right.
And not to say that, like I lived right there, and I think the fact that I was just kind of casually strolling through, looking at my phone, I'm sure that they knew that I lived around there. But they saw somebody who was unprepared to be, who wasn't on the lookout at that moment for crime elements or whatever. And I've got to think that more than anything, what happened to white friends of yours in Harlem is at least as much about the color of their skin as it is about looking like people who are not at home,
who don't belong, quote unquote.
Not
I mean, not literally don't belong, but as the criminal would see it, or the what I mean,
right? I mean, if Norbit was walking through Harlem, like he would also be at high risk for mugging, I think.
Right.
So I think that's it. Like, I would be fascinated actually to if and I'm sure somebody's done this sort of like on the ground sociological work trying to figure out, what gentrification does as far as gang activity is concerned, and who the victims are, and why those people are selected as victims, because it's hard to know,
Right.
I'm just making suppositions here. I mean, I think when this blogging heads idea was presented to me, they wanted me to go up against a libertarian and talk about healthcare and gun control laws, as if being shot makes you an expert on either. Right, like being tortured makes John McCain an expert on foreign policy or something like that. I don't know. Like what this incident gave me was a sort of more visceral understanding of the fears that white people have living in dangerous neighborhoods, and the reaction people have when their sense of safety or security is punctured. And I mean, I think, obviously we've talked for 40 minutes about that, so there's interesting stuff there, but I hesitate to say too much about, I just don't, I don't know.
Right. No, and I think that's a good impulse, but you've just given me an opportunity to do a little self-promotion here.
Okay.
And it's relevant. My new memoir was published this summer. The paperback is coming out in January, and I'm mentioning that for a very specific reason.
Okay.
One of the things that I tried to convey, and this just hit me as you were talking about this, in D.C., and I'm sure you've seen some of this, there's a great, hubbub about school reform down there, and test scores and, bringing kids up to snuff. And one of the things I really tried to get across in the memoir is what it feels like to grow up as a kid in the city when you are at least as concerned about your safety, the ability to get to school, as you are about what goes on in a classroom. In fact, probably more concerned about your safety and what effect that tends to have. And so, I think one of the things that people don't get, and this is just so true for young black boys, that same fear that white folks who don't know, driving through the neighborhood feel, young black boys, and I would put this in the age of probably about 11 to about 15 or so. Because after 15, you start to learn certain things and you carry yourself a certain way, and things sort of change a little bit. But in that period, those kids are afraid. I mean, just really, 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 really afraid and struggling with how to, deal with just the daily presence of the possibility of violence. I mean, I talk about in the book of, finding different routes to get home, trying to figure out which one was the safest route to get from school and back. So there's, I think, a sense, among some people that, we should see this as an us versus them thing. But there's also the opportunity for great empathy there, I think. To see that. And again, I'm just going to theorize here. I would suspect even, with gentrification, the majority of the victims are still black. And I'm not even just in terms of murder. I'm talking about, just random daily sort of, assault or whatever, young kids are dealing with. There's the opportunity to see things through their lens. And I've always, wondered to what extent, that affects outcomes. And what I mean, like, just literally not feeling safe.
Right. Well, I mean, I'd like you to elaborate in a second on just the nature of the danger. How common was it for kids 11 to 15, like you said, to get beat up or mugged or stabbed or whatever? How real was that fear, and how much was it just sort of part of it probably was, but to what extent was it just lore? That these are hard streets. And if that, but it almost doesn't matter to the point I want to make, is that if that fear is real, then that sort of presents a real opening for not somebody necessarily like me, but somebody who's like well schooled in how to talk to at-risk youth, to be like, that fear you feel, if you don't like that, if it troubles you, and you wish it wasn't a part of your life, then you have real reason not to want to fall in with elements like X, Y, Z. Right. But would like for you to talk a little bit about what that risk was. Right. I mean, well, if anything ever happened to you.
If you don't mind, I'll address the questions in backwards. I'll take your last one first. I think I was just listening to you talk. The first thing is, even getting kids to admit that they're afraid is a very hard thing. Yeah. Because they see that as an invitation for more violence. Yeah, that's how that's perceived, and it's really up to adults to push past that. But there are a couple of things that you should know. I come up in the late '80s and early '90s. I was at Howard from about '93 on, so I'm talking roughly like '87, '88. To about 92, 93. That is the height of the crack era. As much as we talk about crime today, I always tell people we really need to remember what it was like. I mean, this is Bill Bennett going around talking about a generation of super predators. It was a very, very scary time for a lot of people. In terms of a literal, it's like, sort of this theory of catastrophe, like, there's not a very good chance that in your lifetime a comet will hit the Earth. But if a comet hits the Earth, it's the end of civilization. Right. So, the fact that it may not, be very likely to happen doesn't make you less afraid because the consequence is so high. So, everybody I knew, I was in a very, sort of unique situation. I was at this inner city middle school, one of the more violent middle schools in the city. In fact, just as I can tell you a wirehead here, there's a scene at the end of season 4 where they're bringing the bodies into the gymnasium.
Right.
And the woman asks Cedric, she said, what'd you choose the school for? And he says, Lamel, I used to go here. That's the middle school I actually went to.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they actually shot scenes in the middle, so it was so wild to see that. I mean, they got it, like, exactly right. I really believe they were actually pulling from that period for much of that inspiration.
I think that David Simon has said as much, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, they nailed it. I mean, that really was the period. They got it, that scene where Bunny has all the kids in the gymnasium. I'm certain that gymnasium is Lamel's gymnasium. It just looks so familiar. And the mannerisms of the kids, they got it down. I'm rambling. I'm going to get back to topic.
Sure.
I was going to that school, and I was in a gifted and talented program in that school, which was like it was the worst of the worst. If you think about it, I mean, here you are. It's bad enough to be a nerd, you know what I mean? But to be like a nerd in that sort of situation, we were constantly afraid, and everyone I knew, got jumped. Everyone I knew had gotten, sort of jumped, except people who had fallen in with other people. Who would prevent you from getting jumped. They were only people who, was sort of spared that. It wasn't so much that it really was going to happen that often, but, nobody likes to be, to have essentially their body taken from them. You know what I mean?
Right.
No one likes to, be in a situation where they're controlled by someone else. It dictates so much of who you are. I mean, it changes the way you look at the world. It changes how you look at other people. It changes your willingness to be sensitive. It ruins your access to certain emotions to the extent that, and I've talked to my brother about this, who's also in the book and who came up under a similar situation, to the extent that once you go out into the adult world, you have great difficulty, or some difficulty, depending on who you are, great difficulty for other people, transitioning in, because the rules of what will keep you safe in one place are not the same as what will keep you safe in another place. In other words, it's a very different thing to have rules to protect you, while you're walking down the street. You got to look a certain way, don't smile, walk like you know where you're going, preferably have about 10 people with you. You can't show up to a job with 10 people. You know what I mean? It helps to smile a little bit and, look at people, it's a different, rule set.
Right, and I mean, I think that probably says a lot about why people who are in that situation are scared of the day-to-day, but not scared of things like driving around in a car or whatever. Right. I mean, it's just that you don't know what the assault, if it's going to happen, is going to look like, and how bad it's going to be, and that sort of unknown. I mean, I've got to imagine it stays with you for a long time, even after you're out of the danger, right?
Yes, that never leaves. It never leaves, and you're constantly. I'll just, my dad is going to kill me for saying this, but I'll give you a good example of this. I was in LA with my dad when the book first came out. We were out there for a book tour. We had been flown out there to be on the Tavis Smiley show. Highlight of my dad's life. He's going to be on TV, national TV, with his son. He was so excited, right? Mm-hmm. After we're done, we're downtown LA at this very nice hotel. We're about to go outside to get something. He says, son, I want to drop my bags off upstairs. And I said, oh, okay, all right. And then he said, because if I got to throw, I want to be ready. My dad is 62, 63 years old.
Right.
You know what I mean? But he comes out of North Philadelphia, West Philadelphia for a little while, out of a completely different time where that was the thinking. You know, and it really never goes away. I mean, it's and that's not a good thing. I'm not saying that to be, as I say, as I started saying this, to be braggadocious about that, because I think it actually inhibits you in a lot of ways, in terms of what you're able to see in the world.
Right, and I mean that's I didn't have real life anecdotes to fall back on, but that's sort of the people that I'm talking about who came at me and asked me what sort of angry racist feelings this had created in me. This was sort of the point I tried to make, is that as angry as I am at the person who did this, I'm also sort of concerned that he and many of his peers are have become acculturated to things like not just doing bad things to people, but of being certain that bad things are going to happen to them.
Right.
And in that way, I mean, it's sort of a cliche liberal thing to say, but they're unfortunate victims too. I think the efforts of people who get mugged and who care about inner city crime, they're just sort of better spent trying to interrupt that dynamic than they are trying to, referee particular tensions or hostilities. Just to nip the problem before it gets to the point where kids are running around certain that they're going to get, their butts kicked.
Right.
And scared about it, and then thinking that maybe the best way to alleviate that fear is to start kicking some butts.
Right. Right.
But yeah, I mean, I won't tell your dad.
I'm sure he'll see this, so he'll call me with he always does to comment. I think we're running over here.
Are we?
Yeah, you don't want to get started with me, man. I once did a 2-hour one. My first one, I went for 2 hours with Megan. They had to split it in half.
Oh, okay. Because the last thing, I guess,
yes.
Totally off topic, is that until we talked on the phone today, I wasn't totally sure if I should call you Tien or Ta-Nehisi or what. So I went and I looked for your first Blogging Heads episode to see if your name was mentioned or how you were, and I couldn't find your first one. I just found the one you did with John McWhorter, and it was of no help because I don't think either of you uttered the other's name a single time. And maybe that just says something about the.
You couldn't feel the love.
I didn't feel much love there.
I have love for John. I got
he was a professor of a course that I didn't actually attend but crashed back at UC Berkeley.
Oh man!
And I thought he was a brilliant linguistics professor, and
right.
it was only after I picked up a book called Losing the Race that I realized that I wasn't exactly dealing with your standard linguistics professor. But
no, he's so much more. Much more.
Anyway, it was a pleasure.
No, this was great, Brian. I mean, it really, this was, I think, a very unusual blogging hit. It was great for me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, it was good for me too.
All right.
Take care, man.
Talk to you.
Bye.